So good evening again, and I'll go ahead and start to share my screen so we can start to work with today's session. Glad to see folks that have joined us. And we're going to continue along this path of workshop sessions on trying to think about how we might continue to enhance, update, connect with our students online or hybrid, blended, in whatever mode. I think one of the biggest things here that I'm trying to share is that these are some strategies that we may be able to use in all kinds of ways and in modes, and maybe if we do some informal settings and inside the class, outside the class. And so I hope that people are looking at these as just ways that we can connect with our students, part of our teaching toolkit, and we can use these when the time arises, whether it's this month, next month, or next year. The third in this series of 6 is, again, based on the survey that was sent out. And this was the third most popular topic, which is project-based learning. And I've been working with project-based literally for about 2 decades. And these are potentially very powerful ways to help connect our students to authentic projects and concepts. And I'd like to share with you a little bit of background and then get into some pretty logistics, very pragmatic ways that you can incorporate some of this into your classroom. Again, as usual, please don't hesitate to ask a question, unmute and ask, or you can type something in the chat, or you can go to our shared Google Doc and ask a question there. I'll try to get to those as I can. As a reminder, it's kind of difficult to see the chat pop up while I've got it in presentation mode, but we'll get your answers to you as soon as we can. So like any good presentation, I'm sure you do the same. Here's our outcomes after about 55 minutes. I'm hoping that you're able to do some of these, which would be to kind of explore this concept of PBL. Maybe some of you have been using it and you're looking to ways to improve it. Others maybe have heard about it and think that there's some real positive aspects. And I do hope to share some of those, as well as some of the challenges that we may want to be aware of. I'm going to start off with kind of an overarching theme of inquiry-based learning, because PBL is a derivative. It's a sub portion of a larger framework of inquiry-based, and I'll share with you what I mean by that. By the end, I'll share with you maybe some examples and some ways that we can use what's called driving questions to instigate and to drive our projects. And then lastly, I'll share with you some slides on design principles and teacher support, and maybe some examples, some concrete things to help you take some of the next steps. So the foundation from my approach, most effective teaching is this concept of inquiry. And it is even more so in project-based, because the concept of inquiry is this whole thing of asking questions. Obviously, it isn't just simple low-level questions, and we'll talk a little bit later about higher level and low level and divergent and convergent. But the bottom line is we need to know how to ask and frame up a series of questions in this form of an inquiry. Initially, we need to do a lot of this, and then hopefully, halfway through, maybe near the end of the term, students are doing more of this in a self-directed. We talked about self-directed, self-regulated in the previous session of this series. So you'll see me really refer a lot to the foundation of inquiry along every aspect of project-based learning. As a reminder, the inquiry method has its roots in the Socratic method. Socrates, I'm sure that a lot of us recall some of our history classes. This is really popular in many types of disciplines, is using what's called the Socratic method. And in that, I'm hoping that people realize that is embedded again, it's not a lower level. These were very high level connective questions. And we probably realize very quickly that these are more difficult to construct. They're more difficult to deploy. They're more difficult to maybe get students involved. Many times I think that some students think that this is a bit of a game. Education is a game. It's kind of a them against us. We ask a question, they give an answer, we tell them they're right or wrong. If they're right, oh, that's good. If they're wrong, it's bad. And it sounds very kind of linear, low level, almost like a guessing game. And of course, we know that's not how we learn, especially in a meaningful, deep way. is that we have to actually struggle and kind of be confused and be asked difficult questions and ponder and reflect and all these. And so these are the kind of things that the Socratic method does. I'm going to be up front and make sure that I'm always kind of honest about these. This is not easy. This is actually a difficult approach, because you have to really think about and anticipate and have dozens of possibilities in your pocket ready to deploy based on where the students start to go, and making sure that you're kind of helping them move in that direction. And so you're the facilitator, right? This is, student-centeredness is a catchphrase, but student-centeredness really is the embodiment of the Socratic method. And it's more along the lines of not what we know. I know I get a lot of students that are really proud that they know they've memorized a lot of things, but the Socratic method really deals more along the lines of, well, how did you connect that? What's the process that you walked through in your mind? From environmental chemistry point of view, we use the science process. We observe and we infer and we predict and we communicate and we make some decisions. And so these are some processes that we may want to know. And ultimately, right, it was very engaging. And this is something that you'll find more and more online, is we need to find some ways to engage our students in a very sustained way. Maybe low level, but there needs to be these constant kind of connections that the students feel like that they are part of the class, or part of a class and a community as we walk along. So inquiry-based learning, IBL, has some attributes. And again, I'm going to use this as an umbrella, because you'll see that a lot of these different things that you've probably heard about fall underneath these. So things like project-based learning, experiential-based learning, cooperative-based learning, collaborative-based learning, problem-based learning. These are all, they're great, every one of them, and I'll talk about them a little bit as we get to the end of this session. But I want to remind folks that these are all kind of subcategories of a broader theme of this inquiry-based learning. And so I'm going to really encourage you to understand the foundation of inquiry, understand how you ask good questions, understand how you get students to ask really good questions. And you'll find that you'll be able to then select portions or maybe multiple parts of these project and experiential and kind of group them together in ways that really work for your classes. Lots and lots of student exploration. You'll see that this is a common theme. We use the word engagement, we use the word student-centered, we use the word experimentation. These are all similar terms, and they're really, what they're trying to do is they're trying to ensure that the student is being active. You've probably even heard about these concepts of active learning, hands-on learning, minds-on learning. Some of these are just catchphrases, and I'm not going to say that they're good or bad, and they're as good as we can use them. And so don't get caught up in some of the terminologies, and try to really stay focused in on the literature, on the research, on what we know that works. But you will hear me say and talk a lot about engagement. And online, we're going to find that this is going to be, it's always a challenge, but we're going to find that it's another level of challenge when we work with students online. And even if you're looking at students to working in your classes in a hybrid or a blended mode, then the engagement question comes up in, what are you doing during those other times? What are you doing when students are in the asynchronous or between classes? And there are some really key ways that we can keep them engaged. And I think that project-based learning is an ideal way to do that. And that leads me to the last part of this inquiry-based, is that we should also really kind of realize that a lot of the questions, a lot of the reflections will take place outside of the formal classroom. Outside of the physical classroom, outside of the virtual classroom, these will take place. And so we need to almost plan inside of our system this opportunity for them to continue this kind of growth. I do want to share with you, so now we're going, we went back a couple hundred years with Socrates, and now we're going to, go back, some decades with John Dewey. So these are basically some real background that this has been around for quite a while, and it's been quite effective. If you really are looking into the research of this, we've kind of gone up and down with how we tackle our education system. But John Dewey talked about this inquiry as, it's grown from some conditions of experience. And so therefore we should probably provide some experiences to our students or capture some of the experiences that they have and allow them to bring those into the class and have conversations with those and really integrate those into the projects. But you'll see that I'll bold certain words, and I'll talk quite a bit about challenge and difficulty and confusion and frustration and all these words that initially sound not pleasant. I think we need to turn that around, and we need to see some of these terms as essential to doing what we want to do, which is really understand and be able to work with some of these concepts after, during and after our classes. There's this concept that Dewey talks about of this need to restore balance, which some of you may recall from your learning theories classes is actually a tangent from Piaget's disequilibrium, where we want to kind of restore that balance, and we typically do that with either accommodating or assimilating some of those thoughts. And the bottom line, this is probably the good news that we kind of can think about is it's pretty natural. Inquiry, project-based, asking questions, it's actually a very natural thing for natural, normal human beings, especially younger human beings. We'll ask a lot of pretty insightful questions. And if we can foster that and we can kind of gear them to creating more of those questions, I think it's going to be really helpful when it comes down to getting them engaged in these projects. And the bottom line is he does touch upon brain research, and there's been a lot of stuff done on this, and you may have been following some of this. It's kind of gone in and out of fad, but the brain is actually going to react to the stimuli of questions, especially if they're questions that make you really uncomfortable or uncertain, or dig upon some things in your past. And this connects with another one of our learning theories that we have talked about at least twice, of the information processing model. So the stimuli, the input, working memory into long-term memory, and then code and decode back into those. I'm going to kind of, there's a kind of a significant background, right? So I mentioned that if you're looking for things to tie to yourself, for those constructivists out there, those people that like to take and really focus on the connected portions between these concepts, you'll find that inquiry and project-based align well with that. Engagement is always going to be key. There are some strategies that we'll talk about in depth, but the basic strategies are group work, which I hear time and time again that nobody likes. I struggle with this because I still say, you know, as a social scientist, what they're saying is they're really addressing what we call a confounding variable. They don't know if they like or dislike the group work because it's typically the structure that isn't set up well, so they can even determine whether they like the group work or not. I always kind of remind folks that after students leave our class, they don't all walk out individually and go sit in a corner someplace. They're social people. They want to get together and talk, and they want to be in groups. And then somehow we say that they don't want to work in groups in the classroom. So I disagree with that. I think they naturally do want to work in groups. What they don't want to do is to have a structure, which is part of our role, that doesn't facilitate some of the natural processing of their brains, some of their abilities to reflect, some of their opportunities to really be successful. Other strategies are discussions, and we've talked before, and we'll talk many times about how discussions are difficult to run, to lead, to facilitate, to build into their normal kind of way that they think. Case studies, role plays, very popular, but I have to say, those are sometimes difficult to create, and they're even more difficult to facilitate. And so these strategies, nobody disagrees with, but it really comes down to the teacher trying to work with these strategies and build them into a context. And that's some of the things that I'll try to share with you for examples at the end of this session. The bottom line of this is the background was that students are going to be actually much more self-directed and try to do some work on their own with minimal guidance. And we'll see where the ultimate way to do that is to try to increase their intrinsic or their internal motivation. I like this chart. I'm going to kind of keep it up for a couple of minutes to let you take a look at this. And what I would recommend you to do is just kind of glance at the top category there, and the traditional, the structure, the guided, and just to yourself think, where am I? Where is my teaching philosophy currently on this scale? Are you typically do traditional hands-on, structured inquiry, guided inquiry, student-directed inquiry? You know, where are you on that? And if you're not sure, take a look at the little data points below. When you do have students work on projects, you know, whether it's questions and materials, procedures and results, how much of this is driven by you, and how much of it do you allow them to do? even the traditional hands-on. So this isn't even a traditional lecture. With the traditional hands-on projects, many times teachers are doing still most of the heavy lifting. They're coming up with a topic. They're coming up with a driving question. They're providing the materials. They're giving the procedures. They're telling them how to organize their results, and they're giving them a structure and maybe even helping them come to their own conclusions. This is definitely better than lecture, right? It's allowing students to actually play with these things, but you'll see that this is trying to guide you towards more of you having your hands off and students doing more of this. I doubt that many of you are at the far end of this column, and there's no need to be now, but wherever you are, you may start to think about how can I create a more student-centered, how can I empower students more to come up with their own materials, how I can come up with their own designs, keeping in mind that they need to have some examples of these, they need to model these. Sometimes instructors will say, well, I need to tell them. I need to do it for them first. And of course, we might recall last time we talked about deductive and inductive methods. That is certainly one way to do it, but you could do it the opposite way, right? You could kind of give all kinds of examples and models and confuse them intentionally and have them unpack those ideas. But the bottom line is you want to figure out where you want to be on this, and then figure out as you design your courses and experiences online, if it's measuring up to this approach. So I mentioned questions a few times, and we've even talked about like really the essential part of this definition of inquiry is question asking, but that's kind of a tricky idea because I could ask you, you know, what's your favorite color, or when is your birthday, and that is a question. I mean, I think we'll all agree that that is a question, and it does have an answer, but that's not the kind of questions that we're talking about here. There's basically, McComas and Rosier basically developed this two-tier, low and high, and then convergent and divergent. And I'll put all these notes and links to these papers in case you want to read these. This is a pretty good paper. I've got 2 slides on this, and I want to share with you that if you are interested in really being more intentional about your question and how you're questioning and how you're building students' ability to question, you might want to really give this paper a look. Typically, and I've got it in big bold red there, a very common way that teachers end a concept or a lecture is they'll pause and they'll look out and they'll say, so are there any questions? Or did everybody understand that? And I don't know about you, but seldom have I ever received, you know, really good questions or really almost anything at that point. Typically what happens is students, this is new information, and so they're confused. They don't even know what they might have a question of, let alone the courage and the ability to ask a question, which may sound silly, may be off topic. And so typically it's not very effective. And so instead of saying, are there any questions, we should think about a very clear program. And they kind of talk about how to ask successful questions, whether it's, you know, how you phrase it, how you adapt it to different situations. Are you sequencing it? And again, that doesn't mean easier to more difficult. It means that there's intentionality about how and when you're asking these questions, because you know kind of where you want them to be. Are there balance in your questionings? Are you asking some low and high? Are you asking some convergent and divergent? Again, this is not a recipe. There's no perfect way. It comes down to, before you go into class, having some ideas and a plan, but being ready to, you know, to work off of what's going on in the classroom. They may understand some things. They may get confused about some things. There may be some misconceptions that are generated. You're not going to know these until you actually start to engage them in some of these questions. What's their participation? You know, I'm really big into trying to get them to ask some question. How are you probing and looking for cues and having them probe each other in ways of question and answer type approaches. Wait time is a really popular one. I don't know how many people have mastered this. I personally, I'm terrible at wait time. I really have to work on it. 3 to 5, maybe 5 to 6 seconds we should be waiting, which seems like a long time for students to come up with. The way that I've been able to address some of this is I'll give them like 1-minute papers or muddiest points, but I'll ask them a question, I'll provide them a prompt, and I'll ask them to literally write some things down, which addresses that wait time for me, because it allows them to process, write down, I can see some things, and then obviously ultimately the student questions. What I like about this paper, though, as well, is they give some really specific examples of some questions. Then they've got a bit of a checklist. And so if you're interested, this is just a small portion of that checklist. I thought I would pick out a few questions that really resonated with me. And you may want to kind of look at this and just evaluate yourself when you have some time. You know, what is your question asking ability at this point? Some of these questions I thought were pretty good in that it made me even think, like, how often do we challenge students by asking questions that arouse their curiosity? This isn't a content question. I'm not asking them to balance an equation. These are questions that basically, how often do I do something that makes them go, wow, I don't know that. I want to think about that, and I'm gonna think about that over the next couple of days. No, I'm not gonna get points for it, and I'm not gonna do homework on it. I'm gonna think about it because I can't stop thinking about it. It's just interesting to me. And so you see how this goes above and beyond academic areas and disciplines and content. How many of those questions are you asking? And are you making it part of your kind of repertoire, part of your regime, things that you actually are going to ask on a regular basis? Questions like, you know, are you revealing some misconceptions in science? There's tons of these misconceptions that happen. I do a lot of work up front to figure out what some of these misconceptions are so that we can kind of deal with those. Number 4, you know, see relationships and compare. You've probably seen a lot of terms here that are related to Bloom's taxonomy. Are you escorting them up the knowledge and comprehension, application analysis, synthesis, evaluation phases? Are you building rapport? You know, a rapport isn't you ask a question, they give an answer. A rapport is somebody else comments on it, or somehow they integrate it into a conversation that was held previously. I mean, that's this enduring, sustained rapport that you might want to ask. And the bottom line is are you finding a way that your questions are modeling some ideas so that students themselves are asking questions? Because to me, this is when I know I finally am making some progress, is when students can ask a question, especially if they're an integrated question. And they say things like, well, you know, last time we talked about this, and this time we're talking about this, and how do these two things connect? I think that they connect this way, but it seems like that's golden, right? That's when they're well on starting to really think about some of this in a very independent way. So I mentioned that inquiry was kind of this umbrella, and this is just a graphic to show that these are all portions of these. And so I'm going to now unpack some of these. The first one is going to be project-based. That is the kind of topic of today's session. So I'll spend most of the time, most of the next 30 minutes or so, really focusing on project-based learning. As you might imagine, it's a large topic. I will include a very intensive literature review as a link to a paper inside of our shared Google Doc so that you can access this and read as much as you'd like to know about it. But the bottom line here is a project. There's lots of ways to create a project, but it should actually obviously engage the students in a sustained investigation. This is the big difference. It isn't just about a question or a chapter or a test or a week. A real good project-based learning should cover the entire semester, or at least a month, but something that allows them to really sink their teeth into something, struggle with something, revisit, reflect on something, and then your goal would be to figure out some milestones, touch points, ways to gather some information. We can call this formative assessments. You can call it whatever you'd like to, but making sure that there's movement along a certain path. And the big thing here with project-based, and you'll hear me mention this a few times, and I'll use this word that some people sometimes aren't quite sure what it means, but there is a product, an artifact, a deliverable. There's something concrete and tangible that's going to be created. Now, when I say concrete, it doesn't necessarily have to be a physical thing. It could be a song. It could be a synchronized swim. It could be a role play. It could be a software program. But it's something that actually is a culminating or an end product that was built upon all the previous conversations and plans and concepts and so forth. And so that's the real key, is looking at that end artifact. So I'm going to share a few key points of why we want to do these, right? So it's going to promote construction of knowledge. This is rooted in the constructivism, which we talked earlier. It's allowing students to take all these facts in isolation and make connections between those. And what I do mostly is I really kind of assess the connections, not the facts. We need to be upfront with our students to let them know that. Many times they think, hey, I've got this fact and now I know this. And we all know that you can Google almost any of this, but you can't Google their personal ways that they've connected those facts to make sense to them. Engagement. You'll see Krychek's name up here. He's been doing work, I think between 2000 and current. So for the past 2 decades, I use his model quite a bit. So you'll see Krychek's name come up quite a bit when I talk about PBL. Scaffolding, a super easy word to say, but very difficult to do because you have to build multiple scaffolds, which means you have to build multiple resources for multiple venues and approaches for students to be able to access and continue movement. So we talked about engagement, but engagement also needs to be coupled up with movement. Movement in there, maybe not physical, but movement in there, producing something. This is a big one that sometimes we forget. This is one of the main reasons why I do project-based, because it encourages choice, which allows them to be more self-regulated, really gets them more interested in things. We're back to the intrinsic, the internal motivation. A lot of times people say, especially teachers will say that, well, students don't want to do this and that. If you will allow them to create some of their own questions and things that they see in their lives, they are more apt to really be, spend more time on it, higher quality, more connections, more conversations. And then we have to support this collaboration. I'll keep referring back down to the group work. We don't like, students may not like the group work, but once they realize that by collaborating, things are actually easier, they make more sense, they're more powerful, they're more enjoyable, then they may use those a little bit more often. So ultimately, you know, how are they going to demonstrate their learning in these PBLs? I mentioned that they're going to be creating this project, and the project or the product or the artifact typically is in correlation to some sort of a driving question, DQ. I'll use this symbolism quite a bit. It's this physical representation, as I mentioned a minute ago. It could be almost anything, but you really want to think about that end product, because that's what ultimately is going to drive and what's going to allow you to assess the progress towards that. I can't underestimate, can't overestimate the concept of reflection. That's the point, really the major point of some of this PBL, is that it allows them time to do what we naturally want to do as humans, which is like, what just happened and how do I know that happened? And each day you start to connect different things. I don't know about you, but when something comes up and I'm thinking about something, or I get introduced to something, all of a sudden I start to see things in my life and on the road and then online, and I'm kind of focused in on that concept. I do a lot of literature reviews, and so things that I probably wouldn't have paid attention to, all of a sudden now I can connect to some things. And so that's the point of this reflection, is by giving them these driving questions, they start to see things in their real life that they wouldn't have initially thought were connected to it, but then they see how it might be connected to it. This concept of authenticity is usually really brought up quite frequently when we talk about project-based, because a lot of times our education is a bit artificial. It is a bit, let's do it because we're supposed to do it, as opposed to let's do it for a reason. We know that it's going to be have real world applications. It's going to be connected to my career or my next year, or somehow it's going to actually help me in one way or another. And so creating authentic products and artifacts, sharing this with authentic public audiences. We can talk a bit, if you're interested, about how that might happen using technology. I use it a lot, just through WeChats and through blogs and through different ways to connect either the general public, or I tend to bring in specific public, like experts in the field, my colleagues, and they interact with students in their project basis. And obviously lots and lots of active work documenting this active work. The one thing that I find time and time again is that some students will have conversations, and just like a lot of times we do in our meetings, and afterwards, the next week we say, didn't we meet, and what happened, and were there action items, and did anyone take notes? And so part of the structure is we need to really build this in. And what we can do is we can have somebody take notes, but I encourage my students, and I show them clearly how to do this, is that during conversations, either face-to-face or especially now online, is they can bring up a Google Doc They can hit the microphone for voice to text, and it can record all of their conversations right there that they can turn into meeting minutes. They can go back and they can add action items and people's names to it. And then I, as the instructor, I can see all that as well. And it's all done with really no energy, no effort. And it allows them to document and track things a lot easier. That's another key part of really having a good and well-structured project base. I'll list all of these, but these are obviously, if you haven't seen these by now, and these are just a small subset. PBL has become real popular. There's many, many resources out there that you can access. Edutopia is a popular one, Mathalicious, Buck Institute, PBL Works, and some other organizations that are out there. So if you're ever curious about it, along with all of these notes that I have, you're going to have tons and tons of resources if you're interested. It's going to be a bit overwhelming. You may want to try to figure out how you may want to start things slowly and then build upon if you haven't a lot of experience with PBL in the past. So I kind of like, now we're going to talk about teacher practice. And I kind of like that the whole point of this is this confusion kind of an approach that I mentioned earlier about some people, especially students, initially don't like PBL because it doesn't always feel good. I've also got a really interesting article written just a few years ago about the sequence and the need for frustration and confusion for learning to happen. And for what it's worth, to let you know, the findings for that is that they have found out that in isolation, being frustrated or confusing isn't advantageous, but in the right amounts and in the right order, this actually is, it helps learning in a deep way. So part of our goals as the instructor is to build those environments. I always tell my students, one of my main jobs is to kindly annoy you. I want to constantly keep you kind of like, oh, that doesn't like feel quite right. Like, why is he saying that? And that doesn't make sense. And I don't know that. And how would I know that? And what, gosh, what? That's this kind of attitude that I would like. Again, I use the word kindly. I don't want them to be frustrated and struggling just for no reason. I want them to be having this healthy frustration where they're constantly trying to become unfrustrated. And that's my job to make sure that I lay some of those things out. So I have to plan. I have to figure out a plan that allows me to adapt to my students, the timing that it takes, the context, what's available to them. So this kind of a project is not going to be a one size fits all. Lots and lots of interactions, but one of the kickbacks of this, the drawbacks that some people say, is that you have to be aware of classroom management. Sometimes your students may not know when to be on task, may not be productive. So how are you going to motivate them to do that? How are you going to create some group dynamics? I've got some ideas on that if you'd like to know. But I really like this research from Thomas just about a decade ago. He found that really experienced teachers, so teachers that kind of knew what teaching was all about, rarely saw this misbehavior. I don't want to jump to conclusions, but that may mean if you are seeing that students are off task and you're having a hard time managing them, maybe it's not the students, maybe it's not the project-based learning, maybe there's something deeper going on that you haven't really created a culture of learning, and you may be missing out some essential parts of how you're teaching in the first place. And I'd love, if you're interested, I'm happy to work with you on that so you can determine where you're at with that. Part of what we indicated last time, I think, or the time before, about effective teaching. Inquiry, right? What is our role? This is really difficult sometimes for especially new career teachers. We want to do more than we probably should. So we need to initiate this inquiry. We need to let it go as far as we can and know when we need to step in, but only step in when we absolutely have to. Sometimes let them feel a little bit of temporary pain, frustration, confusion, and then try to help out when they need it, but only when they need it. So we're the coach. We're modeling things. We're providing resources. You know, I've got a colleague of mine that working in higher ed. That first thing he says to his students is, you know, why did you hire me to teach you? And it's a really different concept. Sometimes we don't think about that. Now, maybe K through 12 doesn't do this as much, but there is this kind of a concept of, you know, I am here to provide you some resources and guidance and assistance. How can I do that the best? Well, we have to have communication, and I have to have a good, clear structure. This can be a really difficult way to teach and to learn. There's lots of debate about this. Sometimes people think that the project base is easier. Sometimes it gets confusing and they don't get the points. And that's why we resort typically to lecture. We think that we can get it all covered if we just say it all. But in actuality, we know there's lots of research that indicates this just isn't the case. So the difficult thing is that teaching and learning is it's uncomfortable. It's not straightforward. And so trying to promote this in a way you can do with PBL much easier. So what are some of these design principles? If you're going to set up a PBL, you want to make sure that it's measurable. And I mentioned something like touch points or milestones. You want to think about developing the end product and maybe back calculating what are some of those steps. And to do that, you probably want to come up with some sort of a rubric. Week 1, week 2, here's what you should have done. Both qualitatively and quantitatively, you should have so many pages written, words written. Here's the quality. Here's how I'm going to judge the quality. And obviously, we talked earlier about developing reliable and valid rubrics. You may even want to calibrate these with some colleagues that maybe are doing some similar projects. You want to address the content and this assessment. So think about these different approaches that you're taking may require some different assessment. They may be rubrics. Maybe you have them do some quick little micro teaches. Maybe they share out. Maybe they put some things on Google Doc. Maybe they represent things via WeChat or graphically or with pictures or with digital audio, but some way think about how you're going to keep them interested and engaged and constantly creating and documenting their progress. This is all, and it should be all, and I would encourage you to inform your steps in your practice by some research. There's tons of research on this. If you're ever interested in doing this and collecting some data, I'm happy to work with you on this. Even if you don't publish it and become famous or whatever, just by simply thinking about this in a research way starts to help you formulate what you're doing and get better at this, and your students will definitely notice this. Obviously, thinking about how you're going to continue with this, engaging in this kind of workshop series is really important. Hopefully you develop some cohorts amongst yourself, you're talking amongst yourselves, you're sharing amongst yourself. Teaching can be a very lonely place. We need to find some ways, some people, and some methods to make sure that we're sharing the kind of things that we're doing. I do have some examples that I'll post on the Google Share Doc. I'm just going to share this one briefly. This is the one that I use. This is a derivative of Krychek's model developed about 2 decades ago. I break mine down very simply into these 5 steps. I have a driving question, an investigation, collaboration. They use some technology, and they create an artifact. What's key is I spend a lot of time on the driving question. I come up with the DQ, they come up with sub DQs, and then I check off week 2 to make sure that their sub driving questions are feasible, worthwhile, meaningful, sustainable, contextualized. This is right out of his model. I modified it a little bit, but you want to think about these kind of broad strokes. From this, I do develop a pretty intensive rubric. Like I said, I've got some milestones that they have to do week 2, and 4, and 6. And I kind of walk them along that process. And so PBL is what I call a full contact sport, is something you can't just hand out and think it's going to run its own. It has to be really integral in almost everything you do. If every time you talk to them, there should be some mention about this PBL. One of the last things I'll say about PBL, then I'll go on to wrap up with some of these other inquiry-based learning approaches, is that sometimes it doesn't work. And here's some reasons why it may not work for others, and it may not work for you. So you may think about these ahead of time and see if you can address these. The first is that you haven't established the why. Simon Sinek's got a book that's entitled, Starting with the Why. So students need to know, why are we doing this? Why is the project important? Why is it going to help me learn? And so you may want to make sure you start to build the culture with that and reinforce that having them do these projects really can help them understand the why, and then they can move along and figure out all the rest of the parts of that project. Keeping in mind that this is, the key thing here is it's a process. It's not a question answer, a test, a quiz. It's basically, if you're treating this as just like let's do PBL instead of let's be PBL, right? This is going to be part of who we're going to become. We're going to become a group of students that really looks at learning in a project way. The questions that you ask, I'll share a couple of mine that I've got. You'll see how I come up with mine at the next slide, but you want to make sure that they're important to the students as well. Engagement and collaboration, you can't give up on the collaboration and the group work. If it doesn't go well, you've got to find ways to navigate around those. and you haven't answered these questions that you really need to. So you need to think about what are important questions to the students, you know, that day, in your city, in the world, and really focusing on those. So here's a few of my questions. Again, this may not pertain to you because you may not be teaching what I'm teaching, but I really have thought a lot about these. These are the three that I go to, and I just want to share with you examples, because sometimes people think that they have to be big and large, and actually the shorter and simpler they are, because you want these to drive. And so the way that I look at DQs is you want them to be incredibly sticky. And when I say sticky, I mean that almost anybody can look at that and connect something to those. The first one, my favorite one, now again, my background is in water chemistry, is what is in our water? Now that seems like a fairly simple question. It's got just a few English words in it, but they're really deep. And for instance, you know, I walk them through and we pick this apart. So the word what is in our water? Well, that could be, when I say what, it could be cations, anions. It could be SVOCs, naphthalene, benzene. It could be all. So the what is what's actually what we're looking for. It's the chemicals, right? And when I say what's in our water, do I mean, is it soluble? Is it a precipitate? Is it a plasma? What phase is it in? So even the word in is a bit interpretive. Our water, are we talking about our city water, our world's water? Are we talking about our local water, our well water? And even water. Is this brackish water, salt water, saline water, potable water, rainwater, groundwater? Like, so you see how each one of those words are springboards to other things. And so the permutations from that one question, you know, is probably, you know, a factorial of 10 or 20. And so everybody can get engaged and really personalize that question. The second one is my second favorite, because a lot of times students don't realize they just put the garbage out, and it all depends on where you live of where the garbage does go. But you know, where is it? Does it go to some dump? Does it go to a landfill? Does it go to incineration? Does it go to recycling? And what even is garbage? There's a big push in Shanghai, I know, now about these 5 different containers, and you've got to sort them all out, and they go to different places. And so this is a really popular, and I have to say that between garbage and water, my students always have something to say about this, because these are things that we do every day. They drink, they throw something out almost every minute. They seem to do these kind of things. And so that's why that they're so sticky. And even like again, environmental chemistry, what do we breathe? Why do we breathe air? What's in air? Why don't we breathe sulfites? Why don't we breathe? And so some of the people that want to get involved in some biochemical reactions tend to look at those. And so I'm hoping that you have thought about, I'm hoping that you're thinking about. The first step is to come up with a really good DQ that's going to be functional for you. Let me kind of work on really briefly. I'll run through the rest of some of these so that you get a sense of what some of these are. So experiential-based learning, keeping in mind that these aren't standalone. Every one of these that I'm going to share, you can use multiple ones of these in a project or in inquiry-based. I'm just going to kind of share it so that you're really intentional. I integrate experiential-based learning in my project base, because we do go out to the landfills, to the water treatment plants, the wastewater treatment plants. And so I don't treat them as different. I treat this as part of the project. And so in my rubric, I have sections on that talk about, and they have to gather data while they're in these informal contexts, while they're having conversations with experts, laymen's, parents about the environment, about where their water is and where their garbage goes. And so I want to integrate all those into this project. And so these aren't standalones, they can be added, but I encourage you to be very intentional about how you're adding these. Cooperative, this is part of this projects, the groups and the structures. I do find that teams can work well, but I have to do a lot of work up front. And I think I shared this diagnostics with this team earlier, that you've got to figure out how they're going to work. They should have different skill sets, but you also have to model. You may have to actually develop a protocol to help them actually understand how you get along, how you be productive, how you take notes, how you ask questions. These are some skills that I know they have in a normal kind of way, but in class, I just think that most of our students haven't really been successful at this. And then also thinking about this team approach where everybody needs to kind of help each other out. If they do this in a an appropriate way, you'll find that they actually do learn a lot from each other, and maybe some things that are sustained, and they build some skills that they may be able to use in different classes and in life in general. I'm sorry, it's cooperative, so collaborative, similar. Cooperative is pretty much getting along. Collaborative is really thinking about how you're taking the information from each person as a puzzle, and everyone has their skill set. This is typically where I assign them to have different abilities and different, bringing different things to the table. And so collaborative has to kind of think about, you know, the sum is greater than just the parts. And that's going to take you to figure out either how you're breaking the project down, how you're aligning those with the skill sets of and the interest of the students, and how the students need to see very clearly that they can't complete the puzzle without everybody getting along and figuring out how those pieces of the puzzles connect. And the last one that I'm going to mention, and I could do a whole series on these. Some of you are probably using problem-based. Sometimes PBL gets confused with PBL. So there's project-based and there's problem-based. And I'm not here to judge either. I tend to use project-based. I feel like it allows me a lot more ability to do some different things. A project doesn't need to have a problem. A problem typically has to have a problem. But in either one of these, the instructor is really trying to empower the students. You can see that by the graphic there, kind of a traditional is, you know, that you tell the students, they memorize it, they do it. I would even challenge sometimes in the problem-based, if you want to be radical problem-based, it says here that the problem is assigned. Maybe you allow them, the students, to come up with the problem, you know, based on certain parameters. And then they, of course, identify and they go about solving those. And so a lot of the things that we talked about with project-based can actually adhere to the problem-based as well. So just as a wrap up, oh good, so it's we're right at 50 minutes, so I wanted to leave a couple minutes for questions. Here's what we started off with about 50 minutes ago. I was hoping that we were able to walk through some of these aspects, and hopefully you're glancing at those and saying, okay, yeah, we talked about that, that, and that. I knew this, I didn't know that. I'd like to look up more about this. I'm going to go to the shared Google Doc and check some of the links and some papers so that when I build my PBL projects, I'm able to really attend to some of the current research on how these are done. So with that, I'm going to thank everybody for their attention. I'm going to stop sharing and stop the recording.